Okay. Once again, welcome everyone. My name is Abu Naseem. I'm the host of our Act and Process lecture series. We have gone through a journey in the series covering each of the 6 components of the Hexaflex model. We have gone through diffusion, acceptance, selfless context, contact with the present moment, values, and committed action. Today, we'll be holding our final lecture in the series, RFT Primer with Brian Mundy, LCSW-R. Brian practices individual, couples, and family behavioral therapy in private practice. He is a peer-reviewed trainer in ACT and is the recipient of the 2012 National Association of Social Workers New York City Emerging Leader Award. He is the co-author of the Guilford Press book, Therapy in the Real World, and has authored peer-reviewed chapters and articles on trauma, family therapy, and acceptance and commitment therapy. He is a New York State accredited trainer and has served as adjunct assistant professor at the New York University Silver School of Social Work for over 10 years. And with that, I will transfer over to Brian.
Thank you, Abu. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. We have a fairly tall order ahead of us, and I appreciate your willingness to go along this ride with me in talking about RFT for 1 hour. It should be fun. I also, before we get started, want to put a plug for the New York City chapter of ACBS, which is hosting this training. If you happen to be in the New York area, we're having a spring social, summer social, June 14th. And if you want to know more about that, just go to the NYC ACBS page and you can sign up for the mailing list. All right, I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. Hi. So here's what we're going to get into. We are going to talk about how we humans language. And I'm going to provide some examples and uses of how knowing a little bit about how we language, which is essentially what RFT is. It's a theory of learning and language, relational frame theory. Examples and uses of how relational frame theory can be really helpful in a clinical setting. If we get to it, because we might not, we will also talk about how RFT fits with functional contextualism as the building blocks of acceptance commitment therapy. Okay, but first, I'm going to show a video, excuse me, of Bobby McFerrin. Share sound. Almost there. Just need to get the window open. Okay. So watch. You can hear the sound, correct? Okay, great. Ba, 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 ba.
Okay. da da ba ba da 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 ba da 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 ba 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 da 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 ba ba ba.
Okay. I watch this video on a regular basis because it makes me so happy. And why does this matter? And how is this related to RFT? There's a lot of different ways to think about that. And I'm going to get into why it matters. And we're going to refer to this video a couple of times, okay? By telling you a little story about, in 2018, I was sitting in a pub in Dingle, Ireland. And I was watching a game that looked a lot like this. And as someone who grew up in the US, I had not had a lot of exposure to this particular sport that is being represented by this picture. And yes, I was drinking a Guinness, and yes, I was quite content. And my mind did something. And that something is a little similar to how the crowd was responding to Bobby McFerrin. My mind strove to make sense of this game. And it did it without any intentional effort on my part. So my mind, taking in this stimuli, was going something like, oh, the ball looks like a football. And, oh, they're tackling each other. So that's also like football. And there's a net. I think there's a net. And that's like soccer. And they're also kicking it. And that's like soccer. And then, boom, a moment of coherence. I arrived at a moment of coherence where I said, oh, rugby is like a combination of football and soccer. Again, this was not intentional. This was just something that my mind did as a verbal behavior, okay, as a way to make sense of a stimulus in front of me, which is a lot like how the crowd was responding to Bobby McFerrin. They knew what the next note was going to be based on their collective learning history of music and the pentatonic scale, okay? So why does this matter, and how is this relevant to therapy? Well, I would like us to do a little participatory exercise. Imagine that there is a baby growing up in a bedroom that sort of looks like this, where there's a drawing of birds on the wall, okay? And as the baby develops into a young child, and then into middle childhood, the baby develops verbal relations to this image on the wall, okay? So as an example of that, at some point, the baby learns that this image represents bird. And most of us, if not all of us, have seen this, where a young child points and goes, bird. And a relationship is formed between the stimulus, which in this case is the image on the wall, and the word and the sound, two separate things, bird. Okay. And then this relationship of stimulus and verbiage, language, grows. Okay. So another word that might get associated with this image would be nest, right? And another one that might be associated with this image would be feather. So if you don't mind, and if you're willing, just typing into the chat what other languaging might show up in relation to this particular stimulus. Make sure I have chat open. Yes. Blue, beautiful. Flying, tree. Yep. Baby, leaf. Yes. Leaves. Mother. Excellent. Thank you. Surprise. Branches. Like surprise. Family. Beautiful. Anything else? So since we're linking this to the Bobby McFerrin video, how about tweet, 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 right? The sound tweet, tweet, tweet could be another relationship here. Okay, thank you so much. So here are some of what you wrote and others. We have wings, we have pigeons, we have the letters, B-I-R-D, because at some point this bird, I almost said bird, this baby learns how to spell. We also might have egg, wing, feet, beaks, nests, grass, birdseed, right? Also, you might notice the hot dog. What's that about? Well, maybe this child went to Coney Island when they were 4, and his parents or her parents bought her a hot dog, and a seagull came down and took that hot dog right out of the child's bun, right? That experience joins a language network associated with the stimulus bird. And on and on and on. This is a tiny, tiny, tiny representation of the verbal relations associated with bird. So complex that it looks something like this by the time the child is 8. And maybe even so complex that it starts to look something like this. That bird, and someone wrote family, and someone wrote mother, might actually evoke a negative experience, a complex negative experience that has to do with this individual's sense of self. I'm not saying it does, but it could. And I'm going to demonstrate how that works in a moment. So why does relational frame theory matter? This is an example from a recent article co-written by Stephen Hayes. And I have it linked at the end of this PowerPoint. We are verbal animals. We have the capacity to language in extremely complex ways. And it allows us to fly to the moon and build skyscrapers and paint Starry Night by Da Vinci, right? And language can, well, rather is arbitrary. If someone yells fire in a movie theater, and there are people in that movie theater who don't speak English, they're not going to have the same response as people who do. Similarly, even though a nickel is a larger coin than a dime, a nickel has more worth. So we assign often arbitrary values to languages, to words and languaging. And sometimes the arbitrariness of this can be dominant and unhelpful. So here's an example of, let's say this is a third grader. And, you know, third grade, fourth grade is around the time you start getting letter grades in school, depending on where you're going to school here in the States. And she gets a C on a science test. And this is one of her first experiences getting grades. And she's heard like, maybe that's not great, you know, but she's not quite sure what to make of it. And she hears a teacher talking about a totally different situation to another teacher. This is a conversation that was not inclusive of her. She overheard it. She heard this teacher saying, well, a C is not good enough. And the frame that she associates with C starts to take on this not good enough relationship, right? They begin to sort of laminate together. C, not good enough. She is eating breakfast with her family the following Sunday. And her son, her brother makes pancakes, right? He's very excited about this. And he asks dad, you know, hey, you know, what do you think of my pancakes? And he says something like, you know, you're not quite there. They're not as good as mom's. You're not quite there. They're not quite good enough. This then strengthens and complicates this verbal relationship that she has between C, not good enough, because now not good enough starts to relate to the self, right? Brother is not good enough yet. And this network begins to develop. And it could have an influence on her behavior. For example, the next time she has a science test, she may experience more anxiety than otherwise had this arbitrary verbal relationship not been formed. And so she may avoid studying. She may overstudy, right? The point is that it has an influence on her behavior because of this verbal network that's being established. So I like to talk with my patients, because primarily I'm a clinician, about word boxes. This young girl's word box for a C grade is different than my word box. And here's what I mean. Let's say you are moving locations, you're moving your residence, and I am too. And we both have a box that is labeled kitchen, right? And you can even picture it with the black Sharpie scrawled across the box, right? And they might be the same size and they might look very similar. And they have that word kitchen assigned to the box. And we might even both have frying pans in that box. However, my frying pan is green and yours is black. And also my blender happens to be in there, but you don't have a blender, you have a coffee grinder in there. So even though we have the same box, it looks the same, the contents of it, the relationship that you have to the word is different. So now think about the word depression. We have different word boxes for that word. It means something a little bit differently to me than it does to you. Your verbal relational network, you know, and if you, actually, I'll go back. Your verbal relational network to, pardon me, I'm trying to go back here. To depression is going to have similar things as mine, but it's also going to have different things. Yours might have a hot dog, and mine won't. Yours might have shame attached to it. Yours might have the word normal attached to it, right? The word boxes are different, and it's at a level of complexity that the longer I do this work, the more astounded I am by, you know, it's really quite complex. And so relational frame theory helps us, can serve as a guide to understanding how to get in there and essentially make interventions that are in support of valued living for our patients. Because one of the things that we're looking for in ACT is transformation of stimulus function, which is a pretty fancy way of saying something that is aversive, painful, uncomfortable, transforming into something that has meaning. As clinicians, we try to change context in order to support flexibility, right? And I make this motion with my hands because part of flexibility can also be expansion of verbal relations. So you can see here in the example, transforming, I'm a terrible mom, which is a difficult, uncomfortable, painful experience. Transforming that by saying something like, this worry about failing as a mom is evidence of how much you care about what kind of mom you are, and your desire to be an effective mom, and your desire to move towards the kind of momming that you want to move toward. There are lots of ways to do this. And by this, I mean support a person in increased flexibility by expanding the network. Right? It doesn't have to be verbal. It can be a pause. It can be a facial expression. In this case, we are talking about verbal interventions because we're talking about a theory of learning and language, okay? And one of the reasons I show the Bobby McFerrin video, and is not just because I love it, it's also because, you know, how much of the crowd's response is languaging, and how much of it is something else? How much of it is sensory? They can hear the tone, right? But when we're talking about RFT, we're talking strictly about language. So something that anyone who's worked with me for a long time knows that I find it very useful to work together and shape understanding together of as it is versus as it says it is. So I'll give an example. I have to succeed. So as it says it is, if a client is saying to you, or if a patient is sharing an experience of, I have to succeed. As it says it is probably something like, if I don't succeed, it means I'm a horrible human being. I must succeed. And if I don't, I can't go on living. As it actually is, might look something like, my learning history has a lot of instances where success and achievement are strongly laminated to worth. And I have been told in explicit and implicit ways that if I do not achieve, I am not worth anything. Because of that, this rule of I have to succeed shows up very, very strongly for me. Right? So that's as it is. That this relational network is present for me, this verbal relational network. As it says it is I'm a piece of crap if I don't succeed. So another way that relational frame theory can be really helpful is how powerful metaphors can be. In 2 examples ago, we linked worrying about being a bad mom to caring very much about being a particular kind of mom, right? Providing a warm, nurturing home for your child. So that's using language to expand context. In this case, for metaphors, we can use language in a lot of really, really powerful ways. A really common metaphor that you'll hear in acceptance commitment therapy, and maybe some folks here are familiar with it, is driving the bus. And you can look it up. I'm not going to go into great detail about it. But the basic gist is that you are driving a bus towards something that's important to you. And there are passengers on this bus that show up, that are part of the relational network, all linked to pursuing this value, right? Like, you better not fail. And it's better to stay home. People are going to make fun of you. There might be other passengers on the bus saying, good for you, you know, you can do this, right? And this is a very powerful metaphor that I find really useful, particularly with teenagers. And it becomes a sort of shorthand. It's sort of like a verbal shortcut. So that if I am in session with a teenager and I go, oh, that sounds like a passenger on the bus, right? After having established the metaphor, we are moving closer to as it is. And we are expanding away from as it says it is. Another example of languaging as a way to move closer to as it is. I am working with someone whose name is Whitney. That's not her real name. And she has complex trauma, and she engages in a lot of self-injury and other tricky behaviors. And we have developed a metaphor together called whatever Whitney. Right? It's not actually what it is, but in this case, whatever Whitney. So much because it's pointing to a repertoire that she has learned functionally to not care. To go, well, you know, I don't care about that. It's an avoidance strategy. Because moving closer to this thing would be painful, even if it is of meaning to her. And after working with her for 5-6 years, she has gotten very good at spotting that repertoire that she learned, you know, this avoidance repertoire of I don't care. I don't even need to prompt her anymore. But in the beginning, it required some prompting, right? Where I would say, oh, you know, I think whatever is showing up. And she'd be like, well, what do you mean? She'd get frustrated. What are you talking about? You know, well, you know, by saying whatever, you're saying you don't care, and some of that pain goes away. You know, and there's nothing wrong with that. There are times, however, when moving closer to that pain moves you closer to what's important to you. And so whatever Whitney changed over time, where sometimes I would just do this and she'd go, oh yeah, that is what I'm doing. And now I don't prompt it. I haven't prompted it in a long time. She sees it for herself. Which enables her, she doesn't always choose to do this, and that's also okay, but it more readily enables her to move closer to as it is actually, and not as it says it is. It pulls her out of some of the arbitrariness of languaging that shows up here. So relational frame theory can get quite technical and complex. And as someone who, you know, went through learning a lot about RFT, you know, as a clinician, I found it useful to learn about some of the relational frames that are listed here, and we're going to get into these in a moment. However, in the therapy room, I don't think this way, and I personally, and a lot of people do find it useful, but I personally don't find it that useful. I found it useful to have learned about them, but I don't think this way in the room. I think more about languaging, arbitrariness, as it says it is versus as it actually is. But that said, this is an RFT primer, so I want to you know, look under the hood together a little bit. So there are a few different ways that we frame language, right? One is a frame of coordination, which is like sameness. One is frame of if-then, conditional frame. Another is comparison, which is one that is particularly frequent in therapy, especially with social media being so popular. Another is spatial, near and far, front and back. Frames of distinction and opposition. This is different from that. This is distinct from that. Temporal frames, which I tend to lean towards, you know. We all have our relational frames that we lean towards. Another is hierarchical. You know, where on the hierarchy do you fall, or do they fall, or does this fall? And deictic framing, which is I, you, here, there, now, then. So with permission, I'm sharing some examples crafted by Lou Lasbrigado, which is providing verbal interventions matching to relational frame types. Okay. So I'm not going to read all of these. And we can share this PowerPoint after the training, if you wish. So an example of a conditional frame is, if you were to make room for this pain, what would that enable you to do that matters in your life? A comparison frame might look like, is the pain more or less present when you're doing something meaningful? Or a distinction. How would your life be different if you were willingly open to having this pain? Temporal. How might experiencing this pain right now be of value to you in the future? Deictic. If your dearest friend or family member were here, how might that person respond to your pain? And a hierarchical example would be, how could you use this pain in service of something greater to enrich your life in some way? So I want to give some more clinical examples. And I like to think of it as watching language rather than getting stuck in content. So I have been working with someone for about 5 years who also has a history of complex trauma. I work a lot with complex trauma. He is not currently in touch with his family. He's about 30 years old. There's a lot of activity happening in the family that he has been working really hard on setting boundaries around. And let's say his name is Jason. Okay, so Jason's learning history as the youngest in an abusive family that has a lot of addiction, and a learning history involving murder and abuse and all sorts of things. Because of this learning history, one of the ways that he has arbitrarily made sense of the world in a way that really worked for him is a selfing language that basically is, I am a piece of shit. It shows up for him constantly. And he's had his own struggles with substance abuse as well. And it is intractable, seemingly intractable. It shows up all the time. And to use ACT language, he often gets very fused to it. And it might show up slightly differently. It might show up as I'm a creep. It might show up as, you know, I can't take risks. I can't seek connection. because I'm a piece of shit and I will be rejected. You know, it shows up in a lot of different ways, but I'm a piece of shit is sort of one of the big ways that we talk about it. And certainly that shows up for him a lot. So I'll be honest, out of a little bit of desperation, I said, listen, we're gonna just try a little exercise, try a little game. And we're gonna count how many verbal steps it takes to get to I'm a piece of shit. And I gave an example. You don't have to give an example, but I did give an example of saying, using myself and saying, you know, I worry about being a good therapist. And so I named something arbitrary. My sweater is green, right? And I said, okay, so my sweater is green. I don't dress quite nice enough, quite professionally enough. This means I'm not a great therapist. So I did provide that example for him. And I would name really arbitrary things. And he would follow the steps. And I don't remember what they were, but it's something like this, right? So your shoes are brown. And he would go, okay, so my shoes are brown. I wish I had more money for shoes, but I don't. That means I'm a piece of shit. And it was never more than 4 steps. And it was often 2 or 3 steps. You know, I think I did say Beyonce didn't win a Grammy because that was what was happening at the time. And it was surprisingly 3 steps, 3 verbal steps for him to get to I'm a piece of shit. Okay, why does this matter? It's a diffusion exercise. It is a way to try and support Jason with seeing this experience of I'm a piece of shit as it is, which is something that he's learned. And not as it says it is, which is some quality, some assignment of worth to his Jasonness. And you might be wondering, well, did it help? Maybe, maybe, but there's a little more to the story. So sometime last year, we were in a similar place where I'm not worth anything was showing up so powerfully for him that he was frankly feeling suicidal. And he actually said it. God, I'm such a piece of shit. You know, he said it that way. And my response to him was, well, like the floating kind? And he sort of, you know, startled. It's like, what? What do you, like, you know, you're a piece of shit. Are you a floater? Or are you a sinker? And Jason burst into tears. And it was that kind of, I'm getting a little emotional just talking about it. It was that kind of bursting in tears where he's sort of laughing and the tears are coming, and then it sort of turns into this keening, you know, this keening crying. And this is someone who is not that emotionally expressive. There was something about this verbal stimulus in coordination, I think, with exercises like this, and the two of us working very hard to hold I'm a piece of shit lightly. There was something about that particular verbal stimulus that I offered to him that just opened the floodgates. And he was able to see it for a moment as truly arbitrary. And a lightness was observed by me and by him. And the work continues to be hard, you know, it's not like breakthrough and then we're, you know, he still struggles. And also his relationship to I'm a piece of shit has expanded. We've added floater sinker. We've added humor to the relational network. And this helps him hold this experience a little more lightly. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about how this fits in ACT, which I'm really glad we have time for. But before we do that, I want to just, we have about 12 minutes. I want to just see if there's any questions or comments about some of these, about RFT and about clinical applications. Okay. Got it. So I'm just going to move on and we're going to get a little more didactic here. Oops. There we go. So how does RFT fit in ACT? If we're thinking about the foundations of science, right? We want to think about a worldview and we want to think about theories. And then we want to think about application, right? So in ACT, all under the umbrella of evolutionary science, the worldview is functional contextualism, which we're going to define in a minute. The theories are relational frame theory and contextual behaviorism. And then the applications are acceptance commitment therapy, functional analytics psychotherapy, process-based therapy. I would add compassion-focused therapy, and a few others that fit in this umbrella. So what is functional contextualism? Functional contextualism is that when a client asks me, or a student asks me some kind of question, the answer is often it depends. Because it depends on context. You know, I had someone ask me this morning, is it bad if I don't ever want to be in a relationship? No, we therapists get questions like this a lot. And I said, well, it depends. Let's take a look at how that would make sense, given your learning history. There is no one answer to that question. And taken a step deeper, a behavior functions differently in one context than another context. If I have a cattle prod on a farm and I'm herding cattle, that is a different function than if I have a cattle prod and I'm trying to save my children from a bad guy. It's a different function. In ACT, we are particularly interested in how does it function in relation to values. Because what we choose to really focus on is, does this particular behavior move you closer to what's important to you, or does it move you further away? And neither are bad or good. Sometimes it's okay. Sometimes it's necessary. But just identifying, is it moving you closer or further away, is important because it helps us understand the function of the behavior in the particular context that it's in. Therefore, with Jason, we look at how I'm a piece of shit makes sense in a given context. And we also look at how might holding I'm a piece of shit lightly help him move closer to a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning. The truth of an idea is not a stagnant property inherent. Truth happens to an idea. It becomes true, is made true by events. So this is one of the first, if not the first, behaviorist, Watson. In other words, the truth, the function of a behavior, is defined by its context. And it changes, because when a behavior enters context, the context changes, which also, in turn, may change the function of the behavior slightly. So functional contextualism and RFT go together very well. If we can understand the arbitrariness of language, instead of believing the language, we look at how the language functions in a different context. And so how we learn language and how we language as human beings is really important for us to understand, because it helps us determine function in a given context. So they go together like this. And when we add to it, or rather when this is occurring under the umbrella of evolutionary science, we can see how certain languaging behaviors are selected and retained over time, right? Classic example that is in Kelly Wilson's book, Mindfulness for Two, which is also cited at the end of this training, is comparison. Comparing ourselves to others helps us survive. If we were not useful to the tribe when we were hunter-gatherers, we were dead weight and we were cast off. So it helped us to be useful. And so comparing how useful we are to other members of the tribe is something that was selected over time, over hundreds of thousands of years. And so evolutionary science, functional contextualism, RFT, and contextual behaviorism all fit together as foundations for acceptance commitment therapy. And I want to end, because we're just about getting on time here, I want to end with a reference to what I think is the best movie ever made, The Matrix. For folks not familiar with the movie, most humans are living in a simulation. It's not real. It's lines of code that's being pumped into our brains, right? And sometimes doing therapy can really feel like seeing the lines of code descending down from the person's languaging, their selfing, their learning history. And when you're working with that code, you are helping with flexibility. You are helping to expand their relational network, to expand context, even if it's just in the context of your relationship with that person, because you're holding everything they're saying lightly, even if they aren't. Their experience of you holding it lightly is already expanding the network. So the famous quote is, don't just see it as a spoon, see everything around the spoon, right? And if you haven't seen the movie, apologies. I have some readings recommended at the back. Again, we will be sharing the PowerPoint if you wish. We have 2 or 3 minutes left. Does anyone have any comments or questions?
Hey, Professor Mundy. I'm wondering, like, if it's ever appropriate to, like, it sounds like when you teach about this, we should not be, like, resisting the statement that they're a piece of shit. Like, it would be my instinct to say, like, oh my God, like, you're not a piece of shit. Like, but you're saying not even resist with that, like, just work with the code.
Right. So in most cases, and maybe all, but I would say most, in most cases, arguing it is likely to reinforce it. You know, the more I try to tell myself not to think about something, the more I'm probably going to think about it. And so arguing with I'm a piece of shit can actually reinforce I'm a piece of shit. So alternatives might look like, well, what does that feel like? Maybe even, what do you think it's like for me to hear that? Right? Maybe, how long has that been around? I'm a piece of shit. You know, when do you think you first had that experience? These are all alternatives to arguing with it. And I want to point to Bethany's comment. Thank you so much, Bethany, for linking to the summer social. I'll be there. I look forward to that event. It's going to be real fun. We actually had a barbecue on Saturday. That was also really fun. And we are at time. I am easily Googleable. So if you have more questions and you wanna ask, feel free to reach out to me anytime. Okay?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brian, for the incredible presentation and so much learned here. And thank everyone for enjoying and participating in the Active Process lecture series. As we plan out more events, activities, lectures, we'll definitely let you guys know. Please join our mailing list, and so that way you can get access to future events and upcoming activities. Thank you all, and enjoy.
Thank you all.
Be well. Take care.